Somewhere, centuries ago, in the silence between cathedral bells and torchlit alleyways, a man held his breath in the dark. Not for glory, not for honor, but because he had one shot, one chance to disappear a name from history and live to see another dawn. He wasn't a knight. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't ride into battle or sing songs of valor around the fire. He crept through shadows. He whispered through keyholes. He vanished behind doors no one else dared to open. Today, we remember assassins as something elegant, hooded heroes in games and movies, wielding poetic justice and hidden blades. But the truth was colder, lonelier, and far more tragic. In the next 30 minutes, we're not just exploring history. We're walking into a life no one wanted to live, a life of quiet violence, broken trust, and fading footprints in blood-stained snow. So dim the lights, let the past unfold. And let's follow the thread, back to a time when every breath in the dark could be your last. We love the myth of the assassin, a shadow in the night, a hooded figure on the rooftops, a flash of silver, silence. In games like Assassin's Creed or films like John Wick and The Bourne Identity, the assassin is almost romantic, a master of control, a weapon of purpose. They glide through danger with elegance, striking only when it matters. No fear, no mistakes, just clean, beautiful precision. But here's the truth. If you were an assassin in the Middle Ages, you were probably cold, starving, hiding in a pile of hay, and very much regretting your life choices. Medieval assassins didn't wear tailored leather or wield high-tech blades. They wore whatever they could steal. Their daggers were often rusted, their boots were usually soaked, and the cloak, not for drama, for warmth. Because in most cases they were poor, desperate, forgotten. They weren't trained in mountain temples or taught by noble mentors. More often, they were ex-soldiers with nothing left, or thieves with a reputation for getting into places they shouldn't, or simply people who'd been chewed up by life and spat out into the shadows. No one dreamed of becoming an assassin. It wasn't a destiny, it was a last resort. There's one story from 13th century Italy about a man named Ferruccio, a mason's apprentice who couldn't find work after his master was accused of heresy. With no money, no shelter, and a sick mother to care for, Ferruccio took a coin pouch from a hooded stranger one night. The deal was simple. One dagger, one name, one night. That night, he didn't just kill a merchant, he killed every future he might have had. A week later, Ferruccio was found in the river, unmarked, unnamed, unwanted. No legend, no monument, just a whisper. And then silence. So here's the lesson. The myth of the assassin may thrill us, but the reality? It reminds us of how far people can fall when the world gives them no place to stand. They weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were ghosts made of hunger, fear, and fading hope. And yet, even without training, without guidance, without help, they still tried to survive. That brings us to the next part of our journey. How do you learn to kill when no one ever taught you how to live? Nobody grows up dreaming of murder, not even in the Middle Ages. In those years of smoke and stone, most people dreamed small. Bread on the table, a roof that didn't leak, a quiet life no one tried to take away. But some dreams don't survive long in a world that's already decided you don't belong. That's how people became assassins, not by passion, not by prophecy, but by pure, relentless desperation. Imagine you're a soldier, sent to war for a king who's never said your name. You return home with a scar across your cheek, a limp in your step, and nothing waiting for you but debt and silence. Or maybe you were a thief. You were good at it too, but not good enough. The last job went bad. Now you've got broken fingers, a broken crew, and just one thing left intact, your ability to vanish. Or perhaps you're simply invisible. A servant girl who knows the back passages of the noble house better than the guards. A stable boy with calloused hands, sharp eyes, and no one who would notice if you went missing. These are the people who became assassins, not noble warriors, not cloaked monks, just outcasts who realized that death could sometimes pay better than life. There's an old record from 15th century England about a man named Elias. He had once been a court messenger, fast on his feet, discreet with his words. But after his lord was executed for treason, Elias lost everything, his job, his lodgings, his name. No one would touch him. Months later he appeared again, but this time not as a messenger, as a man with red-stained hands and a coin pouch he refused to open. The coroner's notes read only, "Died by unknown cause, found in alley, cloak soaked." He didn't live long, but for a moment Elias was useful to someone. That was enough. That's the tragedy, isn't it? These weren't people chasing glory, they were chasing relevance. a chance to be needed, a reason for someone, anyone, to hand them a name. When the world gave them no future, they turned their back on it. And the blade in their hand wasn't power, it was proof they still mattered. Of course, desperation alone doesn't make someone dangerous. To survive as a killer, you had to learn fast. Very fast. And in a time without training or mentors, survival itself became the teacher. So in our next chapter, we'll follow these lost souls deeper into the shadows, where every lesson came with bruises, blood, and the knowledge that no one was coming to help. Every skill has a teacher, except this one. No one in the Middle Ages taught you how to kill. There were no training grounds for silent blades, no mountain temples, no wise old mentor handing you a dagger and saying, "You're ready now." If you were lucky, you learned by watching. If you weren't, you learned by bleeding. There was no handbook, no tutorial, just mistakes, and whether or not you lived through them. The first thing an assassin learned was silence. Not the kind you practice in libraries, the kind you practice in your bones. How to walk across old wooden floors without a creak. How to breathe without sound. How to disappear, not just from sight, but from memory. And then came the blade. Not a noble sword or some jewel-handled weapon, just a rusted dagger, probably stolen, barely sharp, maybe sticky from its last job, but it was all you had. So you learned to make it enough. Some had the benefit of old military experience, a soldier's instinct for angles and strikes, but most, they had nothing but raw instinct. You didn't learn to kill clean, you learned to kill fast, and then run. There's a story from the French city of Rouen around the year 1371. A man known only as Luke the Butcher tried to take out a minor noble who'd been extorting local merchants. His first attempt failed. The noble moved at the last second, and Luke's blade caught only fabric. He ran, stumbled, hid in a pile of firewood for 3 nights, shivering, starving, listening to guards search every tavern. When they finally caught him, they didn't hang him right away. They dragged him to the market square and made him confess, over and over, until his voice gave out. Then they hung him upside down just so everyone could see what failure looked like. Luke didn't get a second chance. Most didn't. And here's the hard truth. When you learn to kill this way, by doing it badly first, you carry every mistake with you, every noise you made, every drop of blood you didn't mean to spill, every door that closed a second too late. The best assassins weren't graceful. They were lucky. Lucky enough to learn on their second job, not their first. But even in this brutal, unkind classroom, there was one rule they figured out quickly. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to vanish. That became the measure of success. Not how beautifully you struck, but whether or not they ever knew it was you. And when it came to vanishing, the biggest challenge wasn't the kill. It was getting in and out without being seen, past guards, walls, and dozens of eyes trained to notice anything out of place. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow the assassin through the maze of castles and paranoia and ask a question that haunted every job. How do you kill someone who's surrounded by guards and still get out alive? If you walked into a medieval tavern looking for a killer, you wouldn't find someone polishing a gleaming weapon. You'd find a quiet figure hunched in the corner, cloak too long, boots too worn, and something heavy in their sleeve. Their tools, not crafted in secret forges, not enchanted, not elegant, just whatever could be stolen, sharpened, hidden, and trusted to do the job once. The typical assassin didn't carry a fancy blade. They carried a knife that might have once belonged to a butcher or a soldier who no longer needed it. It wasn't curved like a fang or forged from meteoric iron. It was dull, chipped, and smelled faintly of old meat. But it fit in a boot, and that's what mattered. You didn't need a weapon that looked beautiful. You needed one that didn't jingle. Some carried rope, not for climbing in through windows, but for strangling. And trust me, nothing kills the moment like fumbling the knot mid-wrestle. Others used poison. Sounds clever, doesn't it? Drop a pinch in the wine, wait for a cough, walk away clean. But in reality, it was a gamble. Most poisons were made from herbs, mushrooms, or the innards of toads, and medieval knowledge of dosage was, let's just say, imprecise. Too little, and your target just gets a stomachache. Too much, and you're the one foaming at the mouth. There's a case from Prague, 1422. A hired killer tried to poison a tax collector by sneaking into the kitchen and lacing the stew. He mixed in crushed hemlock and belladonna, thinking it would do the trick. It did, but not before the food was tested by a servant boy and the noble's dog. The dog died, the boy got sick, the noble lived. The assassin, caught before midnight, dragged through the streets and tied to the same table he tried to poison. That's what happens when your best tool is guesswork. There were no blacksmiths designing assassin kits. No folding crossbows hidden in sleeves. If you had a good dagger and a decent coat, you were already ahead of most. Some assassins even carried sharpened belt buckles, slate roof tiles, bread rolls with blades hidden inside. Because when your life depends on it, anything can become a weapon. But even then, your tools weren't your greatest asset. Your greatest asset was timing. One clean moment, one quick strike, one breathless exit. Everything else? Just luck. And as crude as these weapons were, they had to be used with absolute precision. Because the people they were used on? They were protected, paranoid, and very, very prepared. In the next part of our journey, we'll walk through the fortress gates, past the guards, and into the heart of power, where killing wasn't the hardest part. Getting close enough to try was. Killing someone is hard, but getting close enough to try? That's where the real nightmare begins. See, assassins in the Middle Ages weren't sent to silence village bakers or sleepy monks. They were hired to eliminate the untouchable. Corrupt nobles, paranoid bishops, hardened generals, people whose entire lives were wrapped in steel, stone, and suspicion. If you were handed a name, that name was never an easy one. Castles weren't homes. They were fortresses, with moats full of things that bite, towers with archers, and courtyards echoing with the clank of armor. You didn't just walk up to the gate and knock. You had to slip in unnoticed, past men trained to kill at the sound of wrong footsteps. And those guards? They weren't half asleep like in the stories. They were sober, brutal, and hungry for a reason to draw their swords. One wrong glance, one stuttered answer, one unfamiliar smell, and suddenly your head is on the chopping block before you ever reach your target. But even if you got past the walls, you weren't safe. You had to know everything. When the guards changed shifts, where the creaky stair was, which dog in the courtyard barked at strangers. And worst of all, you had to guess where your target would sleep that night. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages, they were paranoid for a reason. Some nobles used decoy beds, others rotated rooms randomly. A few even hired testers, not just for their food, but for their pillows. They didn't survive by luck. They survived because they trusted no one. In 1483, an attempted assassination of Duke Johann of Saxony failed. Not because the killer was caught, but because the Duke slept in his library that night instead of his chambers. No guards knew, not even his steward, just a sudden change of heart. And one man's fate rewritten by a locked bookshelf door. That's the lesson here. You weren't fighting just guards and gates. You were fighting unpredictability. You were fighting rumor, routine, and fear. And even when you had the timing, the disguise, and the nerves, sometimes the target just didn't show up. And you waited, hidden in a crate or behind a curtain, for hours, days, listening to footsteps, praying they weren't coming for you. Assassins didn't succeed because they were fearless. They succeeded because they were invisible. And to stay invisible, they had to blend in with a world built to expose them. Which brings us to their greatest challenge yet. Not the kill, not the escape, but the disguise, the ragged mask worn in plain sight, among people who were always watching. If a blade was too loud, too messy, too close, there was always poison. The assassin's whisper, the slow kill, the art of death without a sound, or at least that's how the stories tell it. But the truth? Poison in the Middle Ages was never smooth, never certain, and rarely elegant. It wasn't science, it was gambling. You didn't have access to purified chemicals or glass vials labeled "use with caution." What you had were herbs picked under moonlight, mushrooms gathered from rotting logs, or bits of crushed minerals and toad bile mixed in a wooden bowl. There was no standardized dose, no test batch. You eyeballed it, you hoped, you prayed, and even if your concoction worked, the poison still had to get to your target. That meant slipping into kitchens, bribing or impersonating servants, or pouring something bitter into a goblet and hoping no one noticed the smell. And remember, any noble worth killing had a food taster, sometimes two, sometimes a dog. In 1460, an assassin attempted to poison a bishop's wine at a feast in Krakow. The wine passed through 4 hands before it reached the bishop. The first taster spit it out immediately. The second fell ill. The bishop laughed and ordered a full search of the servants' quarters. The assassin, disguised as a spice merchant, was caught before dessert. And what was his fate? A public trial, a confession under torture, and finally, he was made to drink his own brew. Poison sounds clever, but it wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean, and it carried one very heavy price: silence. If you succeeded, no one could know it was you, and if you failed, everyone would find out exactly who you were. There was no in-between. That's the paradox every assassin lived with. The more skilled you became, the more dangerous you were, even to the people who paid you, because you knew too much. You could trace the whispers back to the mouth. You could name names. You had seen the truth behind the curtain, and in the Middle Ages, truth was the most expensive thing to possess. So the poison wasn't just in the cup, it was in the air around you, in the silence after the job, in the way people looked at you like they wanted your talent, but not your presence. Even if you killed for them, they feared you. And often the person most likely to end your life was the one who hired you. Because in this world, the only thing more dangerous than failure was success. And that brings us to what may be the cruelest twist of all. The closer you got to completing the job, the more likely you were to become the next target. Most people who change history get remembered. Kings have statues, warriors get songs, even traitors end up in the books. But assassins, they leave no legacy, just silence. That was the deal. The one unspoken truth of the profession. If you did your job right, no one ever knew you were there. You weren't supposed to leave a name. You weren't supposed to be remembered. Your success depended on erasing yourself. Even when you struck down a tyrant, ended a war, or shifted the course of a kingdom, the credit went elsewhere. To the rebellion, to the general, to the divine, not to the man in the hood with dirt under his nails and someone else's blood on his boots. There's a whisper in Byzantine records about a man who ended a bishop's rule in the dead of night. No name, just, the serpent passed once and was not seen again. In a Florentine journal from 1387, a scribe noted that a noble was found breathless in bed, as if God had taken him personally. No mention of the man who bribed the cook, no mention of the shadow behind the curtain. Assassins didn't write history, they haunted it. And that's the painful irony. Even when they succeeded, their work was denied, erased, or claimed by someone louder, more acceptable. Sometimes even the people who hired them claimed the glory. He died of illness, they'd say, as the assassin disappeared out the back gate. There were no medals, no pensions, just fading footprints on a cobbled road and a name no one dared repeat. And yet, maybe that's the truest definition of a ghost. Someone who moves through the world, leaves behind consequences, but not a name. These killers weren't villains in black cloaks. They weren't heroes either. They were desperate hands making quiet decisions in loud moments. And when their job was done, they vanished. Not into glory, but into shadow. And maybe there's a lesson in that in a world obsessed with being seen, with being remembered, with being known, some of the most impactful lives are the ones lived in silence. But the silence came at a price. Because when no one remembers you, no one protects you, and often, the people who hired you became the people who feared you most. Which leads us to the final betrayal, not from enemies, but from the very hands that once offered payment, now gripping a blade of their own. You'd think that doing the impossible would earn you trust, that delivering what no one else could, silently, precisely, and at great personal risk, would buy you loyalty, maybe even a sliver of respect. But in the assassin's world, the more you succeed, the more dangerous you become. To your employers, you weren't a partner. You were a loaded weapon they couldn't control. You knew things. You had names. You had seen behind the curtain and walked back out. And that made you a liability. So once your task was done, the very people who paid you often became the first to plot your disappearance. There's a record from Venice, 1472, about an assassin hired to remove a rival merchant. The job was clean, quiet, perfect. But instead of payment, the assassin found a second man waiting in the shadows, a blade to the ribs, a whisper. Loose ends make bad business. He survived, barely, and escaped into the hills. But the message was clear. In this world, a contract is only sacred until it becomes inconvenient. Sometimes clients didn't even wait for the job to end. They'd hire a second assassin in secret, one to kill the target, and one to kill the killer. It was cheaper, cleaner. No questions asked. You couldn't complain. There was no court for hired blades, no union, no appeals. If you demanded justice, you outed yourself, and that usually led to a different kind of justice. The kind with fire, chains, or a public confession carved out of you by a man with iron tools and no mercy. That's what made the job so cruel. Not just the danger, not just the guilt, but the truth that every agreement came with a shadow stitched into it, and you never knew when that shadow would step forward and say, "Your part's done." So, what's the lesson? Maybe it's this. When you live in secrets, you die by them. And when you trade in trust, eventually someone trades you out of the game. Some assassins tried to escape, to vanish into another name, another town, another life. A quiet cabin, a beard, a limp they didn't really have. But even if they outran the blade, they couldn't outrun what came next: the fear, the silence, and the long, slow fading into a life that never truly belonged to them. Let's say you survived. You completed the job. You escaped the guards. You even managed to avoid the second blade meant for your back. You made it out, but you didn't make it home, because there's no home for someone like you. No place to lay down the dagger and be just a person again. Not when you've been something else for so long, something sharp, something secret. Retiring as a medieval assassin wasn't peaceful. It was slow erasure. One day at a time you vanished, not by force but by necessity. You changed your name. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You sold herbs. You faked a limp. You avoided eye contact. And still, every knock at the door made your hand twitch toward the knife under the floorboard. Some managed to disappear. They lived in dusty corners of the world, half present, half shadow, watching life happen around them, never quite part of it. Others weren't so lucky. Some were recognized, a face remembered, a whisper spoken at the wrong fire. And they ran again, until there was nowhere left to run. And then, there were those who never left their hiding places, not out of safety, but because their own minds became the prison. Constant fear rewired them. They stopped sleeping. They stopped speaking. They flinched at kindness. Some even forgot who they used to be, because it hurt less than remembering. A record from a remote priory in 1509 speaks of a Brother Tomas, a silent monk who never spoke, never prayed aloud, and always sat facing the door. When he died, they found a coin pouch sewn into the lining of his robe. Inside was a name scratched into a strip of parchment. No one ever figured out what it meant. Some say he had been a killer once. Others say he was just afraid of being found. But the truth? Maybe he was both. That's the final truth of this life. You don't get a final chapter. No victory, no redemption arc, no peace. Just the long, echoing hallway of a life lived off the map until it ends in silence. So what's the lesson? Maybe it's this: that when you build your whole life around being unseen, eventually, no one sees you at all. And yet, even in this fading, in this vanishing, there was still one flicker of hope. That perhaps, if you moved far enough, hid well enough, stayed quiet long enough, you could finally stop running. But then again, the past never stops following. And even if you found that quiet village, that new name, that distant monastery, one thought still haunted the back of your mind. What if someone else has just been paid to find me? No one is born to be a killer. Not in the fields of Normandy, not in the alleys of Florence, not in the shadows of forgotten kingdoms. But across history, time and time again, societies have built the need for people willing to do the things no one else will admit to carry out the unspoken, to enforce the unthinkable, to disappear problems quietly. These assassins weren't summoned by destiny. They were shaped by desperation and by the spaces society refused to acknowledge. In kingdoms ruled by power, silence was a tool. And when law couldn't reach far enough, or when it was corrupted by the hands that held it, people turned to shadows, to fix injustice, to settle scores, to protect secrets, or sometimes just to keep the machine running without anyone seeing the gears turn. The medieval world needed its ghosts. From the Italian city-states to the courts of the Ottoman Empire, kings and councils and bishops all whispered names behind closed doors and sent coin pouches across candlelit tables. Every powerful society has had its hands dirty. The difference is who they asked to hold the knife. And the moment the job was done, those hands were no longer needed, but never truly safe to ignore. So what does that mean for us now? That we should pity these men or admire them? Maybe neither. Maybe the lesson isn't about the killer. Maybe it's about the world that creates him. When we ignore the outcasts, when we build systems that rely on silence and shadows to function, we shouldn't be surprised when the blade comes from the dark. Because when power becomes too clean on the outside, there's almost always blood somewhere underneath, and sometimes that blood was spilled by someone who never got a name, someone who just wanted to matter, someone who became the ghost we needed, and then forgot. So the next time a story tells you about a mysterious figure in the dark, pause for a moment and remember the real ones. Not the legends, not the heroes, but the human beings who were used, erased, and buried beneath the stories we chose to believe.